Hey everyone, thanks for coming to another episode of the Project Insulin podcast. Today we're with Johanna Fleischman. Johanna, thank you for joining us. You're our second guest. Would love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, so that everyone gets a little bit of a frame of reference.
Sure. My name is Johanna Fleischman. I'm 30. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area as a data scientist for a life sciences company. I love being outside, climbing. I love sewing. I love my cats. I love my friends.
So tell us, how long have you been living with diabetes?
I have had diabetes for 19 years, I think. I was diagnosed January 2005.
Oh, so like
So
your
basically
anniversary.
exactly 19 years. I probably just passed my anniversary at some point. I forget the exact day I was diagnosed.
That's good though, not that big of a deal anymore.
No.
And do you remember the process? Can you walk us through the diagnosis process? How did you find out?
Yeah, so I was 11 at the time. I think I was in 6th grade, and I didn't see anything going on, but I lost these are very classic symptoms, by the way. I lost a ton of weight, I was drinking a ton of water, and my mother, who used to be a nurse, saw the symptoms and basically knew what was going on right away. And I was like, "No, no, no, we don't need to go to the hospital." But one I remember her actually coming to school, picking me up midday, and just taking me. And indeed, my blood sugar was like 400 and something. So I was very much diabetic. And then they sent me straight to UCSF, where I was hospitalized for a few days. I was in DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis, and they got me on insulin. That is kind of a classic diagnosis story.
If
Yeah,
someone's
yeah.
watching who might be like, my kid's
If
wetting the
yeah,
bed
if
or drinking too much or
Yeah,
whatever.
and yeah, I was wetting the bed. I do remember that. I clearly remember. Actually, I have this memory of having my huge Nalgene,
Uh-huh.
and I would need to ration, or I was rationing how much I was drinking every class section, because otherwise I would drink the whole thing in one class section, and I realized that was, like, weird. So
Yeah.
I remember rationing my water for social reasons, and I was like I mean, at the time, I wasn't registering that as strange, but I remember doing that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I did not know this about you.
I did
I
not
don't know
think
this
about that
about you
back
at
in
all,
about 10 years, so
man. And so one of the things that like was interesting when we last spoke was you told me that your interacting with diabetes has kind of come in ebbs and flows.
yeah.
More passionate about it, more focused on it. Take us through the first 10 years, I guess, like how you
Sure.
were interacting with diabetes.
Sure. I'll go over it, like, more briefly, and then if you have more
Yeah,
questions, like, dig in. So I
perfect.
guess the first 10 years would be from when I was about, like, 11, 12 to 22, which that happens to be a critical time point. I would say that when I was diagnosed, and I think the way that pediatric endocrinologists have managed their patients now was very different than it was when I was growing up, because their attitude was very much like, we still want you to be able to be a kid. We want you to be able to have the birthday cake. I felt like their primary objective with me as a diabetic, pubescent girl was, she can't die from a low blood sugar, and we don't want her to develop an eating disorder. Those were the two things they were focused
Mhm.
on. They were not focused on me having normal blood sugars. So I would say that I never really had too much of a problem with the diagnosis when I was young. I was just like,
Mhm.
okay, this is me. I need to take insulin now. I need to check my blood sugar. I didn't have a lot of resentment about all that stuff. I would say that kind of came later. Um, Kind of followed my doctor's directives. I did not change my diet. I had absolutely dreadful blood sugars for most of the first 10 years, especially come my late teenage years, just
Mhm.
absolutely dreadful blood sugars, because I didn't really alter my diet for my diabetes. And so I would say the first years were just, I was just a kid and it was fine. I would say that the second 5 years, so from when I was about 16 to 22, I would say that that's when I really started to struggle with it, I think, because for the record, having non-normal blood sugars or having hemoglobin A1C hovering around 8 to 9, which was my average at that time, does not feel good. Having non-normal blood sugars feels miserable. And then when your blood sugars are roller coastering, that feels miserable. Around 21, 22, I think it was, is when I realized, like, I had to make a change, and this is no shade to my doctors, but I realized they weren't gonna help me achieve normal
Mhm.
blood sugars, and I think more than anything, they didn't really have the tools to do so. It's kind of an
Mhm.
individual decision that you're gonna make your diabetes a priority.
So I didn't mean to do a 10-year range. This is kind of randomly chosen, but it sounds like it was a perfect inflection point for you. Could you talk a little bit about what happened next? So
Yeah.
you decide you want to make a change.
Yeah, I was gonna say, kind of have to talk about the next 10 years, I guess. So, actually, if I'm being honest, I think what really got me to decide I needed to focus on my health was my weight, actually. I think it started as a vanity thing. I mean, a health thing too, but really, I did not feel like my best self, and I was
Mhm.
overweight. Yeah, my blood sugars were yo-yoing. I never had a close call with my blood sugars or hypoglycemia. I never needed to use my glucagon pen, but I do have a memory. This was early college at this point, living in the dorms, of like almost like slipping in my shower because my blood sugars were I had a plummeting high blood sugar, and that was almost a close call, right? So I was like, okay,
Mhm.
I need to do something. So I took a 6 month like internship during which time I was not in school, so I was just working, and during this time, I decided to hire a diabetes coach. So she and I bas she we basically communicated daily. I reported my what I was eating, how much insulin I was giving, the exercise I was doing, and more than anything, the benefit from this was like literally tracking on like an hourly or maybe we can say a meal wise basis what was affecting my blood sugars because I'd never paid such close attention
Mhm.
to what I was eating and how much insulin I was giving. And honestly, I think the biggest change at this point was that this coach encouraged me to go on a low carb diet. And essentially, I can't remember if she said this or if this is like a information I picked up elsewhere, but she said, like, or I do not produce insulin, therefore, I'm essentially carbohydrate intolerant. I do not make the protein necessary to digest carbohydrates, and I was like, "Wow, that makes a ton of sense." For the record, no doctor is gonna tell you to cut all your carbs out, and again, like I said, this is not the journey or the necessity for every diabetic.
Mhm.
I'm speaking about my own experience and what's been good for me. And again, my pediatric endocrinologists were hyper focused on making sure I didn't develop an eating disorder, which has its own benefits, of course. I don't know if that was I don't know if that served me well, but anyway, with this coach, I basically cut fruit, sugar, sugar, bread, potatoes, any kind of high carbohydrate food, and it was mostly like meat, vegetables, eggs, nuts, avocados. Became sort of cheese. That became like the basis of my diet, and my A1C came down from 9 to 6, and my weight, I also lost probably 30 pounds at that time, and then I think I think since that high point, I've lost now like 40 or 50 pounds, which I've maintained for the past 10 years, basically. And yeah, so that was the real inflection point. And like I said, at that time in my life, this originally started as a conversation about fluctuations and taking care of my diabetes or my focus on it. At that time, I was thinking about it every day in the sense that I
Mhm.
was like writing down everything I was eating, all my insulin, all my exercise, how well I was sleeping, tracking my menstrual cycle, everything. I am no longer that, I do not pay that much attention to my diabetes right now, but but the dietary and lifestyle changes I made at that time, I have maintained because it has allowed me to focus less on my diabetes because it takes better care of itself when I'm not eating foods that inherently I can't like my body cannot tolerate very well.
Yeah, that is a really good explanation of the whole story. So thank you for
Thanks. And
sharing
yeah,
that.
and
Yeah.
I would say, yeah, so I was like really focused on it for a couple years there. And then I went to grad school when I was 25. And I've kind of been in autopilot with diabetes for the past 5 years. And again, I'm not as well controlled as I would like to be. My diabetes is well controlled, but my A1C isn't 6 anymore. But the fact that I can live my life and focus on my hobby and career and friendships and diabetes is something I'm like managing at a baseline level that is not exhausting
Mhm.
for me is a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, people talk about diabetes burnout,
Yeah.
and they talk about the statistic that on average you make 180 more decisions a day than
Yep.
the person without diabetes. And I'm sure when you were super into managing it and writing everything down, uh, you said hourly or even less than hourly or more frequently than hourly. I'm sure that is not a sustainable.
It was not sustainable, but I think those 6 months that I was doing it was pretty crucial for me.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I wanted to mention in grad school, I worked for an endocrinologist who worked with diabetes patients all the time. So we would talk about like the clinical aspects of managing diabetes care. And what I said to him that he completely agreed with is that as a type 1 diabetic, like you have to care a lot. You really have to care a lot about managing it well, but you have to be one step removed from it completely consuming you. Like you
Mhm.
have to be one step removed and you have to allow a high blood sugar without getting like emotionally distressed and all these things. Otherwise I think it leads to diabetes burnout.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting way to put it. Like you have to stay.
You have
You
to
have to
care a lot,
care.
but you have to be
Yeah.
absolutely everything.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Interesting. And I actually didn't know that you worked with an endocrinologist in grad school. Yeah.
Yeah, I did, yeah. He was a research clinician.
Yeah. So 20 years is a long time. How, especially because this will be interesting because your relationship with diabetes has evolved and changed over time. But how have people supported you throughout your journey, and how does that look different?
Interesting question.
I know I
I
didn't
will
like put this in, but
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine.
yeah.
I've never felt not supported.
Mhm.
The interesting thing is, again, I have had it for 20 years. As I've gotten older slash as time has progressed, I've noticed that the more people I say, "Oh, I have type 1 diabetes," everyone seems to know another person with type 1 diabetes, even like a close friend. I think
Mhm.
it's, quite prevalent as an autoimmune disease. I feel like most people they're familiar with the disease, honestly, is I think what I'm trying to say. But that said, I don't know. I feel like everyone, the way that each diabetic takes care or manages their condition, I think is different. I think people have different needs. In terms of support, I would say the main thing that people can do to support me in my diet, which is again, it's fairly restrictive. I don't have 0 treats or 0 fruit or anything. It's more like when that's available, if I wanna try it, it's like I have 1 piece of cake or 1 or 2 blueberries instead of having a full portion. I've
Mhm.
become very good at, "I'm allowed to taste this, but I'm not gonna have a full serving
Right.
because I will be miserable later," or like the chances of me being miserable later are high. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that I've necessarily felt more or less supported over time because everyone has always been supportive. I think
Yeah.
in general I try to keep people around me who are supportive of decisions I need to make. People are usually impressed by how well I take care of my diabetes, I think, in the sense that I usually don't like I always stick to my diet because that is easier in the long run. It doesn't even feel restrictive when my choices are really what allow me to feel good.
Yeah.
I would say the main change over time has just been that more and more people seem familiar with the disease and I have to explain myself less. I that's
Yeah.
honestly what I can say about that.
No, that's great. That's coming from a background with someone who has a rare chronic illness.
Yeah.
It's so much of the day to day, like the introducing yourself to new people for her. And when I talk about my sister and her illness, it's just explaining what this even is. So it
Yeah.
must be really nice where it's just like, not that.
Yeah, I definitely do not feel like I need to explain what it is. Sometimes I need to explain how I take care of it, which might be different.
Mhm.
But yeah, different people manage it differently, but usually people know what it's about at this point.
Yeah, awesome. Last question for you. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your diabetes journey or maybe tell your past self? Is there something that you could have told yourself, although like, you went through your own arc? But yeah.
Is there anything I could tell myself? Well, I think yes. I wanna phrase it well. Again, I think this is maybe not the advice that all kids would want to hear,
Mhm.
but I'm a pretty black and white person, I think even as a kid, maybe more so as a kid. So I think, if someone had told me earlier, "You will feel better if your blood sugars are more normal," like, I was not told that as a kid. Some people can have high blood sugars their whole life and they do not develop complications. Other people, they have slightly elevated A1Cs and after 10 years they develop complications. There's a big genetic component to the risk of developing complications that's not well parsed out at all. And I would like to have my limbs and my eyesight and my kidneys. Like I want those
Mhm.
things. I care a lot about
Yeah.
being healthy and I was not really given the direct information as a kid as to how to remain healthy. So I wish my doctors had been a little bit more direct with me I wish someone had told me like, "Hey, your life might be a lot easier if, you know, eat a diet that's a little bit more conducive to the disease you have." But I figured it out. And again, I don't know if that's the advice that everyone would want to hear, but I could have used that information earlier,
Yeah.
honestly. Having to figure it out in my early 20s on my own was like, "Oh, wow."
Mhm. Yeah, and it's not like, yes, you're not giving advice to everyone in the world who has
I'm
diabetes.
not this
Yeah,
is advice that I would have wanted.
exactly. Yeah. And again, the point of this podcast and what we're doing here is not to tell everyone, all right, this is how you have to do diabetes management, because I'm clearly not qualified to
Yeah, and me
that.
neither, and I guess the other thing, and this is I actually read this in, like, a research article, and it's true to my story as well. Actually, maybe this is the more global advice to give. That was very specific advice to me.
Yeah.
This is more globally maybe what I would say. I think that diabetes, I think maybe and I think this is actually applicable to most chronic illnesses. I think it becomes much easier to live with when you accept it as
Hmm.
part of your daily life and identity versus trying to silo it into a separate part of yourself that you need to take care of and that you're at odds with. I think this was a diabetes paper that I read, some kind of clinical paper that was discussing how the people that really accepted their disease as part of themselves and became friends with it, they ultimately had much better like health outcomes compared to the people who are really like resisting
Hmm.
their diabetes significantly. I don't know if that makes sense, but for me, accepting it into a part of my life meant changing my diet. It meant making sure I'm getting regular activity. It meant making, taking care of my body. And in that way, I live a more balanced life. Ironically, I think for some people that would not be the case. I feel like my life is way more balanced because I'm prioritizing my diabetes and just accepting it as part of me
Yeah.
versus it's this thing I need to take care of. I hate giving shots. I hate checking my blood sugar. I think in the long run, that does not really contribute to peace of mind in the long run. But I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's the identity portion.
Yeah, yeah,
Like, what is your identity with diabetes or with a chronic illness?
right. And I think the irony is that like the more I accepted it as part of my identity, the less a part of my life it actually occupies, if
Uh-huh.
that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very interesting. Very good last piece of advice to give on on the so thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's what's worked for me.
Yeah. Johanna, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you everyone for listening. And if you'd like to be on the podcast, you could comment in the YouTube comment or just send me an email at projectinsulin.org. You'll find my email address. Thank you and have a good day.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. This was great. Appreciate your time.
Sweet. Awesome. Cool.